1,000 years ago, someone was lowered into the ground with the signs of a Viking life around them. A blade, a ship, a set of objects placed carefully beside the body, not as trash, not as decoration, but as a message. For more than a century, graves like this seemed to speak clearly. They told us who was a warrior, who was a trader, who belonged to the north, and who did not. Then scientists took samples from teeth and dense bone, sequenced the DNA, and the message changed. The Viking Age is usually placed between about AD 750 and 1050, a period of only 3 centuries. But in those 3 centuries, people from Scandinavia reached England, Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, Greenland, the Baltic, and the river routes of Eastern Europe. They raided monasteries, founded towns, moved silver, traded goods, took captives, settled farms, and built ships that could cross open sea or slide up shallow rivers. The image most people carry is simple: a blond man in a longship, a sword in his hand, a cold coastline behind him. But history is rarely that clean, and graves are not always biographies. So what happens when the bones disagree with the story we built around them? That is the question that changed the study of the Viking world. In 2020, a major genetic study sequenced DNA from 442 ancient humans from archaeological sites across Europe and Greenland. The remains came from places as spread out as Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Estonia, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. It was one of the largest ancient DNA projects ever done on the Viking Age. This matters because ancient DNA is easy to misunderstand. It does not replace archaeology. It does not read minds. It does not tell us what language a person spoke every day, what god they prayed to, or whether they saw themselves as Viking. But it can show patterns that objects alone cannot show. It can reveal close relatives buried together. It can point to ancestry from different regions. It can show that the body beneath the sword carried a more complicated story than the sword itself. And that is where the old certainty began to fail. Not because archaeology had been useless, but because the evidence had become deeper than the grave goods alone. The dead had gained another voice entirely. Before we get to the surprise, you have to understand why the old picture was so convincing. The Vikings left behind objects that felt almost too clear to misread: swords, shields, boat burials, brooches, beads, gaming pieces, rune stones, burned halls, coin hoards, graves with bodies laid out beside weapons and animals. These things mattered. They still matter. Archaeology gave us the first real map of the Viking Age. It showed where Scandinavian-style objects appeared. It showed where ships landed, where settlements grew, where people fought, and where they stayed. But objects can only go so far. A sword can suggest violence or status. A brooch can suggest clothing and identity. A boat can suggest wealth, travel, or ritual. None of them can tell you everything about the person buried beneath them. For years, the story moved from the outside inward. Scholars looked at the grave, then described the person. DNA reversed that. It started inside the body and worked outward. And once that happened, the Viking grave stopped being a simple answer. It became a much deeper question. Because the Viking world itself was never small. It was not just a line of raiders sailing west. It was a northern network built from wood, iron, weather, and nerve. At one edge were the fjords of Norway, opening into the Atlantic. At another were the flat shores of Denmark, facing England and the Frankish coast. To the east were Swedish routes moving through the Baltic, and down the rivers that connected the north to the Black Sea and the Caspian. Along those routes moved fur, walrus ivory, silver coins, glass beads, weapons, captives, and stories. One ship could be a weapon, another could be a market, another could be a family crossing into a new life. That is what made the Viking Age so difficult to reduce. The same people who burned a monastery could also build a trading town. The same roots that carried swords could carry weights, scales, cloth, amber, and children. This was not a simple world of pirates at the edge of Europe. It was a system, and systems leave traces in more than one place. They leave traces in objects. They leave traces in language. They leave traces in the names of towns and rivers. And sometimes, if the bone survives long enough, they leave traces in DNA. That is why the genetic study mattered. It was not asking whether the Vikings traveled. Everyone already knew that. It was asking what happened to people while they traveled. And that question matters because the Vikings were never only a subject of the past. They became an image people kept using long after the ships were gone. In the 1800s and 1900s, artists, politicians, museums, schoolbooks, and movies helped turn them into a symbol. Northern, male, white, warlike, and simple. Sometimes that image was harmless entertainment. Sometimes it was used for darker purposes, as if the Viking Age could be reduced to purity and conquest. The DNA makes that harder to do. It does not give us a modern political lesson dressed up as science. The past was not kind, and the Viking world was not a moral example waiting to be copied. But it does remind us that real history is usually messier than the myths built from it. The people in these graves were not symbols. They were bodies. They had parents, children, scars, diets, diseases, loyalties, fears, and names that mostly disappeared. When we turn them into a single image, we lose almost everything that made them human. The graves do not ask us to make the Vikings smaller. They ask us to stop making them flatter, cleaner, and easier than they ever were. That is the central point here. When researchers compared hundreds of Viking Age genomes, the result was not a clean line moving outward from Scandinavia. It was a web. The DNA showed Danish-linked ancestry moving into England. It showed Swedish-linked ancestry moving into the Baltic. It showed Norwegian-linked ancestry reaching Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. The ships had left genetic traces in the places they touched. But the deeper surprise was that movement had gone both ways. Scandinavia was not a sealed homeland, sending out one unchanged people. It was already being changed from the inside. The genomes showed ancestry flowing into Scandinavia from the south and east before and during the Viking Age. People arrived. Goods arrived. Ideas likely moved with them. Families formed. Children were born into mixed worlds long before anyone in a later century tried to draw clean borders around them. That is the first thing the DNA made impossible to ignore. The Viking world was not a bloodline. It was a system of movement. Picture the map for a moment. Not a flat classroom map with colored arrows neatly crossing the sea. Picture cold beaches in Denmark, river mouths in Sweden, Norwegian fjords opening into the Atlantic, islands scattered across the North Sea, trading towns where fur, tusks, seal fat, silver, beads, captives, and stories passed from hand to hand. A ship leaves one shore and does not just carry men with axes. It carries language, marriage ties, skilled workers, children, coins, rumors, a way of dressing, a way of fighting, a way of being seen. That is what made the Viking Age so powerful. It was not just violence, though there was plenty of violence. It was reach, the ability to connect places that should have been far apart and make them part of the same northern storm. and if you enjoy stories where archaeology, genetics, and history collide like this, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel, and it tells me you want more deep dives into the past we are still learning how to read. Because the next discovery was even stranger. Some people buried in Viking style were not genetically Scandinavian in the simple sense at all. In Orkney, off the northern coast of Scotland, researchers studied men buried with swords and Scandinavian-style grave goods. On the surface, the graves looked like part of the Norse world. The objects pointed north. The burial style pointed north. The story seemed obvious, but their ancestry pointed closer to the local world of northern Britain. The evidence suggests that people of Scottish or Pictish-related background could be buried in Scandinavian fashion and absorbed into Viking identity. That is a quiet sentence, but it changes almost everything. If a man was buried with a Viking sword, in a Viking grave, by a community that treated him as Viking, but his DNA was local, was he any less Viking? For a long time, modern people treated Viking identity like a matter of origin. You either came from Scandinavia, or you did not. But the graves suggest something more complicated. In the Viking Age, identity may have been something people could join, perform, inherit, or be pulled into by power. A local man could become part of a Norse household. A captive could become part of a trading network. A child of mixed ancestry could grow up speaking the language, wearing the style, worshipping the gods, or serving the leaders of a world that did not care whether modern genetic categories would one day know what to do with him. This does not mean ancestry meant nothing. It mattered deeply. Families mattered. Kin groups mattered. Loyalty, inheritance, marriage, and revenge could all run through bloodlines. But Viking was not only a genetic label. It was also a social position, a reputation, a set of practices, and sometimes a choice made under pressure. That is what makes the DNA so important. It does not erase the Scandinavian core of the Viking Age. It makes the edges visible. It shows that the Viking world had doors. Some people were born inside them. Others crossed through them. The DNA did not make the Vikings less real. It made them harder to simplify. And that is exactly what good evidence does. It does not always give us a cleaner story. Sometimes it takes the story we wanted, breaks it open, and lets the human mess back in. That human mess becomes clearest when the DNA stops talking about populations and starts talking about individual lives. One of the most famous examples came from Birka, a Viking Age trading town in Sweden that reached its height in the 900s. In the late 1800s, archaeologists excavated a grave now known as BJ.581. It was rich, organized, and high status. The person inside had been buried with weapons, 2 horses, gaming pieces, and a board used for strategy. For more than a century, the grave was treated as the burial of a male warrior. Then, the bones were tested. The DNA showed 2 X chromosomes and no Y chromosome. Biologically, the person in the grave was female. That does not mean DNA can tell us exactly what she did in life. It cannot show us the battles she fought or the orders she gave. A grave is still not a diary, but the discovery exposed something powerful. The assumption had been built before the evidence was complete. The weapons had already told scholars this was a warrior grave. What DNA changed was the belief that such a grave had to belong to a man. And once you see that, the Viking world begins to look different. Not softer, not cleaner, not less violent, just more complicated. This is the careful part, and it matters. DNA did not prove a biography. It did not show a woman swinging a sword on a battlefield. It confirmed biological sex and forced scholars to return to the grave with better questions. Why were the weapons there? Why the horses? Why the gaming pieces? Why was this burial placed where it was, near a military area of Burka? Why had generations of scholars accepted the warrior reading when they thought the body was male, then suddenly questioned it when the body was shown to be female? The grave did not change. The body did not change. The assumption changed. And that is the quiet power of ancient DNA. It does not always discover a new object. Sometimes it changes the meaning of an object that had been sitting in the plain sight for more than 100 years. Then there is Estonia, on the island of Saaremaa, where 2 boat burials were found near the village of Salme. The larger burial held 34 men. It dates to the very edge of the Viking Age, around the early 700s, before the raid on Lindisfarne in AD 793, that later became the traditional opening scene of the Viking Age in Britain. For a long time, graves like this could tell us about violence, weapons, and burial ritual. DNA added something smaller and more intimate. Among the dead were 4 full brothers. Think about that for a moment. Not 4 samples, not 4 data points. 4 brothers, lying in the same violent ending far from home, folded into a story later described with words like expansion, migration, and raiding. That is what ancient DNA does at its best. It takes a huge historical process and gives it a human temperature. The Viking Age was not only a movement of ships, it was a movement of families, allies, captives, strangers, and children whose lives crossed the sea before modern nations existed to name them. The Salme burial does not give us their voices. It does not tell us what they shouted, what they feared, or whether they expected to go home. But it gives us something almost as haunting. It tells us they did not die alone. It tells us that behind the word raid, there could be brothers. Behind the word migration, there could be kinship. Behind the broad sweep of history, there were people who knew each other's faces. And that changes the emotional scale of the Viking Age. A map can show distance. A genome can show relationship. A grave can show how a community chose to remember the dead. Put those together, and the Viking world stops being a collection of stereotypes. It becomes a world of decisions, losses, loyalties, and movement. A world where a young man from Sweden could die in Estonia. A local man in Orkney could be buried in Scandinavian style. A woman in Burka could be placed in a grave that generations read as military. A child of mixed ancestry could grow up inside a culture that later historians would try to sort into boxes too neat for real life. So maybe the real question was never who had Viking blood. Maybe the better question is who lived inside the Viking world. Because that world was larger than the stereotype. It reached from Norway to Greenland, from Denmark to England, from Sweden toward the Baltic and the river routes of the East. It left marks in language, place names, graves, coins, ships, and genomes. It shaped islands, coastlines, towns, and families. And then, over time, it changed form. The raids slowed, kingdoms hardened, Christianity spread through Scandinavia. Trading towns rose and fell. The longships did not vanish all at once, but the world that made them feared and useful slowly became something else. That is why the DNA matters. It did not make the Vikings less real. It made them less simple, less like a single type of person, more like a moving frontier of culture, violence, trade, ambition, and belonging. At the beginning, The grave looked like an answer, a sword, a boat, a body, a name we no longer know. But the closer scientists looked, the more the grave became a question. Who was buried here? Where did they come from? Who claimed them? Who traveled with them? Who did later historians imagine them to be? And what did we miss because we thought we already knew? The Viking dead had been silent for 1,000 years, but they were not empty. In their teeth, in their bones, in the fragments that survived fire, soil, water, and time, they carried a story bigger than the one carved into legend. Not a pure bloodline, not a simple tribe, not only raiders from the north, a world. The ships are gone. The sails are gone. Most of the voices are gone. But the graves are still there. And now, for the first time, they are correcting us.